Welcome to Hearstory.
Hi everyone, my name is Melinda, and we are here with the Hearstory podcast to talk about this week's topic, which is affirmative action.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew.
My name is Adam.
So we're first going to get an intro of what this affirmative action is all about.
Yeah. So affirmative action was a policy first implemented to promote equal opportunities and address historical injustices. However, the scope of affirmative action has drastically changed since it first began in the 1960s during the civil rights movement. Now, affirmative action is most commonly synonymous with its role in the college admission systems, where it's used to promote diversity across campus. However, the implications of this policy have sparked intense debate and controversy, particularly within Asian American communities. Many see affirmative action as a racial barrier in college admissions, one that is unfavorable towards Asian American applicants. The discourse surrounding affirmative action is now a catalyst for conversations on racial tensions, historical injustices, the model minority myth, legacy admissions, and much more. The recent Supreme Court ruling that overturned affirmative action has only exacerbated these controversies, solidifying affirmative action as a focal point of the Asian American communities.
So on to kind of a question to you both. First, maybe Adam, you can answer this. How important has education been in your life? For example, have your parents encouraged you to pursue an education, or how do you view the value of education in your own life?
Growing up obviously I'm a first-gen immigrant, so my parents both came from China. And obviously then school was a huge focus for our family. I have the privilege, I had the privilege to go to China and attend international school between sixth and eighth grade. And then when I came back to America, I had the other privilege to then attend a private school. So obviously my parents really highly value education. And since middle school, the goal has always been to do well in school, get good grades, do extracurriculars that make me happy, but also make an impact. And eventually the main goal has been to get into, a good college and take off my career from there. Because I know education is kind of like the starting spot for a good career, the starting spot for having a good life. It's always been a really main emphasis for me and my family, especially.
I think that's been the same for me. It's like, even like starting in kindergarten or in elementary school, your parents always want you to focus on your studies and not get distracted. And my parents are very similar. They came from China and they came to the US to study and get a graduate degree in order to work here. They see kind of education as something that allows them to get an opportunity. And for them, that's also something they wanted for my siblings and I.
Yeah, I think especially I know that there is a lot of messaging that's going on, especially now where, obviously my parents are still trying to tell me that, oh, it doesn't matter what college you get into. It doesn't matter like if your grades are like all A's, as long as you're happy, you're doing fine. And even though that I've been getting this sort of messaging for the past few years, I feel like there is still an underlying emphasis on, having to get good grades, doing well in school, because it's more of a personal thing for me, because if I feel like if I don't get into a good school, if I don't do well in high school and I don't get good grades, then I feel like I'm kind of disappointing my parents and failing them in some sense that they just worked really hard to get to America and to put me in the place that I am. So I know that I have to do my best with the resources that they've given me and worked so hard for.
Mm-hmm. So on to kind of like you were talking about the college, like getting into a good college. So what have you guys heard, maybe Andrew, like about the college admissions? Are there things like you've heard in the news about or media about like the process overall?
Yeah, so kind of with Adam, because of the emphasis on college and me myself, I've come to value education a lot, just looking at like statistics about how like education is a huge factor in achievement gap and like the amount of money you get coming out of college. I feel like all this pressure on college has kind of taken away from like the real message of college admissions of be your true self. So you hear like conflicting information where people will tell you that, oh, the best way to get into college is to be your authentic self. The best way to get into college is to do what you love to do. And while I think this is in large part true, there's also a lot of people on the internet, some of my friends, family members, who tell me that sometimes you can't be your complete self. And I think that specifically ties to an Asian American identity. I mean, growing up around a lot of Asian American families, being in an Asian American community, I feel like this idea of not being Asian or being too Asian for the college admissions process has kind of been a focal point or a central point of what people tell me about the college admissions process. Obviously, I haven't gone through yet. I don't know how true that is. But that's just something that's kind of always in the back of my mind, especially heading into next fall. So,
Mhm. I think for me, I mean, having gone through the admissions process, I think there's a lot of like, especially when you read online, because to be honest, like you and your classmates are kind of like unsure because everybody's doing it for the first time, and no matter how much you hear or what kind of like guidance you have, it's always different each year. And I think, especially like this year with the affirmative action case, it's been kind of in the spotlight because it's always like, oh, if you put your Asian American identity out there, you're putting yourself up for all this competition, especially in those big research universities or those universities that focus on like the traditional medical or maybe law fields. And I've also, one of the things that you talked about, you said you were talking about you like being your authentic self. And I feel like it's it's really hard because sometimes you want to, show who you are, and there's always that message of they want this holistic admission of seeing who you are as a person. But I think at the same time, you also see those things on social media talking about when somebody talks about, for example, their mental illness or if they have any mental health issues, a lot of colleges might view that as a liability. And even if that is your true self, you don't really want to show that to the college admissions officers. And I feel like there's always that conflict between like how much of my identity should I be showing and how much should I be proud to show in front of these admissions officers, and how much do I hide or how much do I kind of like fake until I get to the university, which I think is a very interesting point.
Yeah,
yeah,
I've oh, you can go.
sorry. I mean, currently Ad and I are writing our Common App essays, and then like you hear all these stories like, oh, these are the 5 things you don't want to write about. You want to write about like death, sports injuries,
Mhm.
drugs, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think the main emphasis about that is that these essays and the admissions process is supposed to show how you grow. But for a lot of things, I'm just a 17-year-old. A lot of areas I still have a lot to grow, and I haven't kind of reached that climax of my life to the point where I feel like I can proudly say I've worked on every single aspect of myself, and that every single aspect of my identity and my experience is something that I am proud to like showcase to the colleges around the world that'll basically decide my future. So I agree with you in the sense that you kind of have to pick and choose what you really are proud of showing and what you want to show that you think could be favorable. I don't really know how I feel about that because you obviously want to show your true self, but you have to balance that against all these like myths and all these like theories about college admissions you hear from other people.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's especially hard, like if you talk about showing your authentic self, especially in relation to like Asian American identity. I think it's especially hard because for a lot of Asian American students, at least the ones that I'm around and I'm friends with, a lot of their ECs, which are like extracurriculars, a lot of that surrounds around like their Asian American identity. I know most of my Asian American friends are part of some sort of Asian American fundraising club or some part of some sort of Asian American affinity group. And so a lot of times, a lot of what you dedicate your life to, a lot of what you spend your time with outside of school is dedicated to trying to promote that identity and protect that identity and make people more aware of the problems that are going on with those communities. And so I think it gets especially hard when we hear all this information of like, oh, don't try and emphasize your Asianness. Don't try and make it so known that you're Asian because then that places you in a competitive pool that you maybe don't want to go against. I think it's hard to balance that and also the fact that a lot of people just spend their time with these sort of identity groups. A lot of people spend their time on trying to promote their identity. And it just doesn't feel right if you're trying to hide that identity just in the sake of like getting to a good college, because that's just not what you're passionate about.
Mhm. And so we've talked a lot about kind of hiding your identity or like that battle between should you show your identity or should you hide it, based on like if especially for Asian Americans, like the view is that if you show your Asian American identity, you're putting yourself out for more competition. So maybe Adam, you can answer this question. Do you think that education is a level playing field in terms of this process?
Um, I think with all things, education is not probably the most level playing field. There are a lot of inequities and inequalities in it. But more specifically on the college admissions process, if we don't look at it from a race point of view, we look at it from like a more general point of view. I do think that there are a lot of inequalities in the process. For example, paying for AP tests, that costs money. Taking the SAT or ACT, that costs money as well. And I know a lot of schools are trying to combat these inequalities by saying, oh, we're test optional. But then again, those are a lot of the more elite institutions. When you get more to like outside just like the top 20 schools, a lot of them aren't going test optional. A lot of them still require you to send in your scores like that. And so I think when you just look at it from like a monetary perspective, there are a lot of inequalities. If we begin to look at it from a racial perspective, I think we can't just look at the modern college system, the modern day college system, and point out inequalities there. Because I think a lot of it is grounded in historical context. So that's to say that sure, in the modern day college system, there are statistics out there that basically say, oh, you have a harder time getting into college if you're an Asian American with a higher score compared to like if you were any other race. And those statistics do exist. But if we look back like 20, 30 years ago, we can see that it was the same thing but flipped, right? Asian Americans were having a really hard time getting into colleges and getting into these prestigious universities when they had high scores. And that was why Asian Americans were like one of the first groups to start to call for things like affirmative action and diversity promoting policies. And if we look even further back than that, there are certain races that were banned from going to school. And so I think if we just look at the modern day college system and we look at it through a racial perspective, sure, there are some inequalities, but I think that there are other inequalities that have been present if you look at it through like a historical context. And I think those are important to acknowledge. But short answer to your question, yeah, I don't think it's it's a level playing field.
Oh, I was just gonna add something about how, like, in terms of the racial perspective of looking at the level playing field. I mean, it's interesting that Asian Americans weren't that much against affirmative action before like the last around decade, even though it's been in place since the civil rights movement. And I find that interesting because if we just look at the basic statistics, Asian Americans are one of the most overrepresented in terms of like their national population percentage versus the percentage that get into high institutions. Asians are one of the most over or highly represented races inside of like the top tier institutions in colleges. So I feel like when it comes to discussion on like race-based admissions and looking at diversity from a racial lens, I feel like a lot of times Asian Americans have to look at it from a different perspective. How 3, 4 decades ago, we were the ones that were fighting for this policy because we felt underrepresented, because we felt discriminated against, specifically because of historical injustices. So I think it's really important to acknowledge a different perspective and see how history and time and how the statistics have changed our perspective of college admissions in the first place.
I think that's what the point that you brought up was really interesting on how Asian Americans actually make up a large part of the student population in higher institutions, and especially with their good test scores. And also, we've talked about before, kind of like the emphasis on education. There's definitely a lot of Asian students who are focused on academics. And I also remember reading an article. It was very interesting about should we kind of be fighting for our own benefit or the benefit of all? Because obviously, with affirmative action and with a lot of Asian Americans getting into higher institutions, you see on like a bigger picture, like, oh, we're not doing too bad because we have a lot of students, a lot of Asian American students going to these great universities, getting these scholarships and being able to kind of pursue their education. But then that also means that there's always Asian American students or other students who are kind of left out of that because maybe there were 5 too many people left in the pool and they weren't one of the people who got taken. So I feel like it's the case for affirmative action is, and the way that we've seen it today is kind of shaped by, do we prioritize what's good for the group as a whole versus what's good for our own benefit? So I think that the points that you brought up were really interesting about how, like, it's both of you about how the historical perspective has kind of shaped college admissions and kind of how we see it today. So kind of like on that note, how do you guys think that affirmative action has been beneficial to increasing diversity, equity, inclusion among college campuses? Maybe Andrew, you could answer this question.
Yeah. So while doing a little research after the Supreme Court ruling, I kind of stumbled upon a different some different information I expected to. So what I basically found is that a lot of the discourse surrounding affirmative action has basically been about, oh, these college admissions people, they're seeing someone is, for example, Black or they're Hispanic. Oh, we're immediately going to give them preference over, let's say, a white or an Asian candidate. And that's how a lot of the discourse and the narratives against affirmative action have been framed as. But when I looked at the actual legal aspect of affirmative action, in reality, like that's not how it works. So based off like a few Supreme Court cases in the 1990s that started off in the University of California, they basically deemed that affirmative action couldn't be used to directly give preference to certain races. Rather, the goal of it was not to like rewrite historical injustices. Rather, the only goal of affirmative action legally was to promote diversity because diversity was scientifically and statistically proven to be good for college campuses and to be good for academic settings. And so I think looking at it from that perspective, I think it's been hugely beneficial. Just looking purely at the numbers since affirmative action has been implemented, obviously our world has become more progressive since the 1960s. Understandably so. But just looking at how affirmative action has impacted a lot of underrepresented and discriminated communities, me personally, I think it's been greatly, greatly beneficial to promoting diversity across all campuses in the US. So,
Yeah, I think regardless of how you feel about diversity and whether or not forced diversity is a good thing, I don't think anybody can really deny that affirmative action has improved diversity on college campuses greatly. And I think when we look at the question of diversity, I think we really have to trace back for why we want diversity in the first place. Because I think, like Andrew said, a lot of the discourse around affirmative action is really negative. People are saying, oh, you're putting up this white student against this Black student, and they're immediately going to choose the Black student because they like Black people more. It's like, this is a very dumbed down, simplified narrative of how the process actually works. And so I feel like when we talk about diversity, we have to go back to the origins of it, and we have to recognize that the reason that diversity was instituted in law in the first place, the reason why we need diversity inside these college campuses is that diversity is generally like a beneficial thing for everyone, right? Aside from the fact that you have like a more diversified set of perspectives, aside from the fact that you're going to get people that are coming from every single country, every single state that have different economic backgrounds, that means you're also going to get people who are going to be meeting people with new experiences. They're going to be interacting with people that have different ideas with them. And the only way that we can really have improvement in ideals, the only way we can really come to solutions to problems is by interacting with people that are different than us, right? I also think that there are multiple studies that have been done where affirmative action has directly led to a lessening in racial prejudice inside college campuses, right? And that logically makes sense because if you're meeting people from different racial backgrounds, you're meeting people from different ethnic backgrounds, and you really get to learn who they are, it's really hard to then hate them, or it's really hard to have prejudice against certain ethnic groups when you recognize that everybody is human. And that's, I think that's like the crux of affirmative action. It's the fact that diverse campuses lead to people becoming more accepting and lead to people having more intellectual conversation and discourse. And so I think affirmative action in that sense has been really beneficial towards colleges.
And I think the points that you both brought up were really interesting because obviously when people see affirmative action or hear it, they always have this perception of it's always like this race against this race. But I feel like it's very hard for the public, or there hasn't really been much education on what it actually is, or much emphasis on how it's not just one race against another. It's more like how you're giving others the opportunity to achieve higher education or kind of get to a higher point in their life. So what do you guys think with the Supreme Court case, without affirmative action, what do you see as the future of the college admissions process or like the field of education in general? Adam, you can answer this question.
That's a pretty difficult question. I mean, I can't see the future, but I do think that the Supreme Court case does drastically change things in a legal sense, which is basically saying that legally colleges aren't allowed to take race into admissions process, into account for the admissions process. But as you know, a person going into the college admissions process as a rising senior who's like doing all my essays and everything right now, I'm getting a lot of emails from colleges, and a lot of these colleges have sent emails about the recent Supreme Court ruling, basically saying, oh, yes, we recognize that the Supreme Court ruling has happened. We recognize that legally we're not allowed to take into account racial like racial categories and racial preferences inside the admissions process. But all these colleges have been affirming a promise to continue to, you know, promote diversity and, you know, fight prejudice. And so obviously that's really vague language, and I don't know. I'm not well versed enough in like the legality of it all to understand what exactly that would mean for the college admissions process to have the Supreme Court ruling that you're not allowed to have affirmative action, but then have these colleges affirming to their students that they're still going to continue to promote diversity, which at its heart is what affirmative action is. So I'm not well versed enough in the legality of it all to understand what exactly that means, but I do know that colleges will continue to try and promote diversity, whether that be in college admissions processes or not. And so I think when it comes to the question of diversity, I think colleges will still, you know, focus on fighting prejudice. They'll still be giving out scholarships to people. They'll still be not really looking at financial aid to try and like fight these inequities in the process. But I do think if we ban, because the affirmative action has been banned by the Supreme Court, I do think diversity does take a big hit inside college campuses. I can't cite any studies right now, but like Andrew, I did research after the Supreme Court ruling just to look into it because it wasn't a topic I was really familiar with. And there were a lot of studies that were done that says that, yeah, diversity does heavily decrease when affirmative action is not in place. Black and brown people in Black and brown communities have a much harder time getting into higher prestigious universities when affirmative action isn't banned, or when affirmative action is banned. Sorry. So I think diversity does take quite a big hit, and it does lessen and get rid of some opportunities for a lot of these less privileged and people in minority groups from getting into these prestigious universities.
I think personally, I feel like it's with, even though like the Supreme Court ruled that college admissions shouldn't have this sort of affirmative action process, I think for me personally, I think you can't really, I guess you can't really hide who you are. Like kind of going back to what we were talking earlier, like even though during the process you can kind of like manipulate your identity into showing parts of you versus like the other parts of you. One quote that I saw from an article was like, you can't hide your last name, especially for Asian Americans. It's kind of hard to hide your Asian American identity if your last name is like Liu or Zhang or something like that. And I think especially for other people, even not from their last name, it's very hard to kind of stray away from your cultural identity, especially when you're writing these very personal essays, and especially with a lot of essay prompts talking about your family or how, or your hobbies. Like it's very hard to kind of hide that identity that you have, or kind of have this identity or your culture to hide from anybody. And I think it's very interesting that even with affirmative action taken away, colleges are still kind of including more and more people, because diversity, as you guys both mentioned, is a very important factor in the college admissions process and very important for the colleges themselves. But I do think that with affirmative action taken away, it kind of removes that precedent of having diversity, because I think with affirmative action, it reminds people, it reminds institutions how important diversity is to the education process, and kind of taking affirmative action away, even if it's on paper, I think is just a huge hit to the diversity of college campuses, since it's no longer a set precedent that we have anymore.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys have said. I think for maybe like the week after affirmative action was first overturned, I saw a lot of people saying like, oh, don't worry about it. Like just like Adam said, colleges sent out emails. I think one Ivy League school, I don't remember which, like literally said they found a loophole in the ruling or something like that. I don't know, I forget. I thought I saw that somewhere on Instagram. But I had a lot of like messaging come out that everything was gonna still stay the same, that diversity was gonna be fine. But since then, I feel like the kind of social narratives and the way people have talked about college admissions has changed a lot into a much more pessimistic view. Like what you guys were saying, that diversity has inherently just become less at the forefront of college admissions. It's not something that they are allowed to value as much. But Melinda, like you said, I also think it's kind of hard to enforce in a sense that like the Supreme Court and the government can't ensure that colleges aren't necessarily taking race or taking diversity into account for college admissions. So I'm interested to see how this all plays out with the upcoming college admission cycle. I think there's going to be a lot of very controversial discourse after colleges release like their common data sets and their acceptances and the demographics of who they enroll. So I'm interested to see how that pans out, whether or not the statistics really look different compared to the past few years when affirmative action was still in place.
I think all the points that we brought up in this discussion have certainly kind of reflected on what this decision means for education system and also for Asian Americans. And for everybody listening, I'd like to thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast.
Welcome to Hearstory,